They met in Miami on a morning that smelled of salt, sunscreen, and possibility. The kind of morning that feels accidental and inevitable at the same time. The city was already awake, pulsing with color and heat, the sun rising over the Atlantic as if it had been rehearsing this moment just for them. He had arrived the night before, exhausted from a long flight and a longer year, carrying with him a quiet sense of being unfinished, as though his life had paused somewhere far away and forgotten to resume. She had lived in Miami for 3 years, but still felt like a guest in her own days, walking through them with curiosity rather than ownership, waiting for something unnamed to begin. They collided outside a small cafe on Ocean Drive, the kind with chipped turquoise tables and a chalkboard menu that changed daily, depending on the mood of the owner. He was distracted, staring at his phone, rereading a message that said nothing important, while she was carrying the coffees carefully balanced, believing she could manage both without help. The collision was clumsy and unromantic. Coffee spilled, apologies overlapped, laughter followed too quickly to be polite. He offered to buy her another drink. She insisted it was fine, then agreed anyway. They sat down, strangers sharing a table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They talked without urgency, without the nervous performances people usually adopt when they think something might matter. He told her about his work, about how success had arrived on schedule but satisfaction had not. She told him about moving to Miami to reinvent herself and discovering that geography alone was not enough to transform a person. Around them, the city moved loudly, cars, music, tourists, waves, but their conversation felt insulated, like a pocket of stillness carved out of the morning. They spent the day together almost by accident. One coffee became two became lunch. Lunch turned into a walk along the beach where the sand burned their feet and the water cooled them down. They shared small, unnecessary details, favorite songs, childhood fears, the moments in their lives they wished they could rewatch like scenes from a movie. There was no dramatic realization, no thunderbolt of certainty, only a growing sense of familiarity that felt impossible given how recently they had met. As evening fell, Miami transformed. Neon lights flickered on, the air grew heavier, and music spilled out of open doors. They stood at a corner, unsure whether to say goodbye or continue, both pretending indifference while hoping the other would decide. She suggested a drink. He said yes too quickly. They ended up on a rooftop bar, the city spread beneath them like a living map, the ocean reflecting moonlight in the distance. They drank slowly, not because they were cautious, but because they didn't want the night to end. He was supposed to leave in 2 days. They acknowledged this fact without assigning it too much weight, as though naming it would keep it from becoming real. The next day they met again, then again, compressing weeks of getting to know each other into hours. They argued lightly about nothing important, discovered shared silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward, and learned how the other listened. On his last night, they walked barefoot on the beach, the sand cool now, the waves louder, the future deliberately unspoken. When he left, it felt unfinished rather than tragic. They promised nothing dramatic, only to stay in touch. A phrase so small it barely seemed capable of holding what they felt. Yet they did stay in touch. Messages became calls, calls became routines, routines became expectations. Miami appeared in the background of her life through video calls. Palm trees, sudden rainstorms, sunsets that looked unreal. He visited again, then again, each reunion easier, deeper, more certain than the last. Distance tested them, not through jealousy or mistrust, but through exhaustion. They learned how to argue across time zones, how to apologize without touch, how to be present through a screen. At some point, the question of where became unavoidable. She loved Miami, but no longer needed it to define her. He realized that the life he had built elsewhere felt hollow without her in it. The decision emerged slowly and then all at once. He would move. Living together was not a fairy tale, it was better. It was mundane and difficult and filled with small negotiations about space and habits and expectations. Miami became their shared city, no longer a backdrop for coincidence, but a place shaped by routine. Grocery stores, morning runs, late-night conversations on the balcony while the city hummed below. They grew into each other, not dramatically, but steadily, the way roots grow underground. The proposal was quiet. No crowd, no spectacle. They were sitting on the beach at dawn, the same stretch of sand where they had once walked as near strangers. He spoke without rehearsing. She said yes without hesitation. The ocean continued its rhythm, indifferent, and eternal, as if reminding them that their promise was both fragile and strong. They married in Miami a year later, surrounded by people who had watched their story unfold with disbelief and then certainty. The ceremony was simple, the air warm, the lights soft, as they stood together, husband and wife. The city that had introduced them felt like a witness rather than a cause, a place that had given them the chance to collide at exactly the right moment. Their life did not end there, of course. It expanded, it changed, it challenged them. But whenever they walked along Ocean Drive in the early morning, when the city smelled of salt and sunscreen and possibility, they remembered that some meetings are not accidents at all, only beginnings disguised as chance. They continued their life in Miami with the quiet confidence of people who had already chosen each other once and were prepared to keep choosing each other again, even when the city tested them with its heat, its noise, its relentless brightness. Marriage did not transform them overnight. Instead, it sharpened what already existed. Mornings became shared rituals rather than coincidences. They learned the language of each other's silences, the difference between tiredness that needed solitude and tiredness that needed closeness. Miami, which had once felt like a stage, slowly turned into a home shaped by repetition rather than excitement. They moved into a slightly larger apartment near the water, not because they needed the space, but because it felt like a commitment made visible. From their balcony, they could see the ocean change moods throughout the day, calm in the mornings, restless in the afternoons, dark and thoughtful at night. Sometimes they sat there without speaking, each lost in private thoughts, and sometimes they talked until words felt unnecessary. They discovered that love was not a constant intensity but a reliable presence, something that stayed even when nothing dramatic was happening. Work became more demanding for both of them. He struggled with the weight of responsibility, with a quiet fear that he might repeat old patterns of chasing success at the expense of meaning. She faced her own doubts, wondering whether stability had softened her edge, whether choosing happiness had cost her ambition. They argued more during that period, not loudly but persistently, circling the same questions from different angles. Yet even in conflict, there was an underlying trust that neither of them was trying to win, only to understand. Their first real crisis arrived unexpectedly, disguised as opportunity. He was offered a position that would require frequent travel, long absences, a return to the rhythm of distance they thought they had outgrown. The offer promised recognition and financial security, but it also threatened the life they had carefully assembled. They spent nights talking it through, voices low, emotions restrained, both afraid of becoming the obstacle in the other's path. In the end, the decision was not about sacrifice but alignment. He declined the offer not with resentment but with clarity. For the first time, he chose a shared future over an individual achievement, and the choice felt like relief. Time passed in subtle markers rather than milestones. They hosted friends who arrived full of energy and left speaking about Miami with nostalgia, unaware that the city had become ordinary to those who lived within it. They celebrated anniversaries quietly, sometimes forgetting the exact date and remembering it together later with laughter. Love matured into something less visible but more resilient, like a structure reinforced over time rather than a fire constantly needing fuel. The idea of children entered their conversations gradually, not as an expectation but as a question. They spoke about fear as much as hope, fear of repeating mistakes, fear of losing themselves, fear of loving someone so completely it would change everything else. When they decided to try, it felt less like a leap and more like a continuation. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of their days, slowing some things, intensifying others. He learned a new kind of patience. She discovered a strength she had never needed before. Their child was born on a humid summer night, the city loud and indifferent beyond the hospital walls. Holding that small, fragile life between them, they felt the strange combination of overwhelming responsibility and absolute certainty. Miami, once the place where everything had begun, now felt like the backdrop to something far larger than coincidence. Nights became fragmented, days blurred together, and yet there was a deep satisfaction and exhaustion shared rather than endured alone. Years layered themselves quietly. Their child grew, their conversations evolved, their dreams adjusted without disappearing. They faced losses, small and large, celebrated unexpected victories, learned that happiness was not a destination but a pattern created created daily through choice. Sometimes they returned to the cafe on Ocean Drive where they had first met, now more polished, less accidental. They sat at a table nearby, watching strangers pass, wondering how many beginnings were happening around them unnoticed. They never claimed their story was extraordinary. It was shaped by chance, sustained by effort, and deepened by time. Miami remained constant and changing all at once, just like them. And whenever the morning air carried that familiar mix of salt and possibility, they remembered that a single moment, unremarkable at first glance, had unfolded into a lifetime they were still writing together. As the years continued to unfold, their life settled into a rhythm that no longer needed explanation. Their child grew older, curious and observant, absorbing the world with the quiet intensity of someone raised between love and stability. Parenthood reshaped them again, not by erasing who they had been, but by reorganizing their priorities in ways they could not have predicted. Sleep became a luxury, time a carefully managed resource. Yet even in the chaos there was a sense of shared purpose that grounded them. Miami changed around them, as cities always do. New buildings rose where familiar places once stood, old cafes closed, and new ones opened with carefully designed nostalgia. Sometimes they felt older than the city, sometimes younger, depending on the day. They learned that belonging was not about permanence, but about memory layered onto geography. Every street held a version of themselves from another year, another season of life. Their marriage evolved quietly. Passion softened into intimacy, excitement into depth. They no longer needed constant reassurance, having learned through repetition that they were reliable to each other. Disagreements still surfaced, often about things that seemed trivial on the surface, but underneath carried the weight of fatigue, fear, or unspoken longing. What had changed was their ability to recognize those moments not as threats, but as signals, invitations to listen more closely. There was a period when they felt distant again, not from conflict, but from routine. Days passed efficiently, almost mechanically, filled with responsibilities and schedules. One evening, after their child had fallen asleep, they sat together on the balcony and realized how long it had been since they had talked about anything other than logistics. The realization was not dramatic, but it was sobering. They decided, consciously and without ceremony, to reclaim time for each other, even if it meant doing less elsewhere. They began taking long walks at night when the city cooled and the noise softened. They spoke about aging, about fear of loss, about the strange awareness that time was no longer abstract. They remembered their first meeting not with nostalgia, but with gratitude, understanding now how easily it might never have happened at all. Love, they realized, was not guaranteed by destiny, but sustained by attention. As their child grew more independent, space returned to their lives in unexpected ways. With it came reflection. They wondered who they were becoming beyond the roles they inhabited so well. He revisited creative ambitions he had set aside. She returned to interests that had once defined her before marriage and motherhood. Instead of feeling threatened by these changes, they supported them, recognizing that growth did not pull them apart but added dimension to their shared life. Illness touched their family briefly, enough to remind them of fragility without devastating them completely. Those weeks were marked by quiet strength, by hands held in waiting rooms, by conversations whispered in the dark. They learned again that love was practical as much as emotional, expressed through presence rather than words. When health returned, it left behind a heightened awareness of what mattered and what did not. They celebrated milestones without extravagance. Birthdays passed with shared meals, anniversaries with private rituals. They no longer measured happiness by intensity, but by consistency. There were moments of joy that surprised them in their simplicity. Laughter during a power outage, a spontaneous trip to the beach, watching their child sleep peacefully after a long day. One evening, years after their wedding, they returned once more to Ocean Drive at dawn. The cafe where they had met was gone, replaced by something newer, more polished. They stood across the street, holding hands, feeling neither loss nor disappointment. The place itself no longer mattered. What mattered was that the chance meeting had become a life fully lived. They spoke about the future with calm acceptance. They knew challenges would come, that nothing remained unchanged, but they trusted their ability to adapt together. Love, they understood now, was not a constant feeling but a continuous decision, renewed quietly in ordinary moments. As the sun rose over Miami, casting familiar light across the water, they felt a deep sense of completion without finality. Their story had not ended, it had simply matured into something less dramatic and more enduring. They walked home together through streets that had witnessed every version of themselves, carrying forward a shared history built not on perfection but on presence, patience, and choice. And in that quiet certainty, they understood that what had begun as a brief collision between strangers had become a lifetime, shaped by intention, a marriage not defined by city, but forever marked by the morning it had brought them together.